A moonless night. 16th century Japan. A fortress sits on its hill like a clenched fist, stone walls, watchfires, armed men pacing the gates. Inside, a lord sleeps with the certainty that power brings. He thinks danger must announce itself. A banner, a trumpet, a challenge shouted into the dark. But danger doesn't always knock. High above, a shape moves across roof tiles, with the quiet certainty of someone who has trained their whole life not to be heard. No armor clinks, no footsteps betray, no glory is sought. This figure carries no flag and no name worth remembering, because the mission does not require a name. By dawn, the fortress will still stand. And yet, everything will be different. A gate left unbarred at the wrong moment. A storehouse inventory that no longer matches reality. A message that reached the wrong hands. A rumor that spreads faster than fire. And the defenders will ask the most terrifying question a soldier can ask. How did it happen? Without us seeing anything at all. This is where the legend begins. The ninja, the shinobi, the shadow warrior. For centuries, they've been painted as supernatural assassins. Black suits, star-shaped blades, smoke that swallows the world, hands forming mysterious seals that summon impossible power. It's a beautiful fantasy, clean, cinematic, easy to sell. But history is rarely that neat. The real shinobi were not magic. They were something more unsettling. They were professionals, specialists in infiltration, surveillance, sabotage, and deception. The kind of people modern intelligence agencies would recognize instantly. Not because their tools were futuristic, but because their mindset was. They understood something many warriors refused to accept. Sometimes the fastest way to win a battle is to avoid it entirely. To understand how that idea took root, we have to go back, long before the ninja became a name spoken in whispers. We begin in the Heian period, when Japan's imperial court ruled from Kyoto in a world of silk robes, poetry contests, and carefully choreographed elegance. On the surface, it was refined, civilized, polished. But beneath that surface, the country was changing. Out in the provinces, far from courtly ceremony, local strongmen built private armies to protect land, settle disputes, and enforce their will. These early warriors were not the romantic samurai of later legend. They were practical men in a practical world. Bow, sword, horse, and a willingness to do what the capital could not. And into this shifting landscape flowed new ideas, from China, from travelers, from monks, from texts carried across the sea. Among them, a simple, dangerous principle. All warfare is based on deception. Japanese war leaders did not ignore it. Even as the warrior ethos leaned toward direct confrontation and personal honor, many commanders saw the truth. When two forces are evenly matched, information becomes the deciding weapon. When a castle cannot be taken by siege, a single weakness, discovered, exploited, can collapse everything. And Japan's geography made that kind of warfare not just useful, but inevitable. This is a mountainous country, rough, steep, unforgiving. Most of the land rises into hills and ranges that fracture communities into isolated valleys. Travel is difficult. Control from a distant capital is fragile. In the mountains, local autonomy survives longer. And where autonomy survives, different rules can grow. In those high places lived people who moved differently, like the Yamabushi, mountain ascetics practicing a harsh blend of Buddhist, Shinto, and folk traditions. They endured cold, hunger, long treks through wilderness. They learned weather, trails, plants, and survival. Skills that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with staying alive. Historians still debate how directly such groups influenced shinobi traditions. But the overlap is impossible to miss. If you can live in the mountains, you can travel without roads. If you can read terrain, you can vanish into it. If you can endure hardship, you can operate where others break. Then Japan's political order shattered. In the late 12th century, the Genpei War ripped the country apart, and the result was a new reality: military rule. And as conflict became routine, commanders used methods that look, through modern eyes, like early prototypes of shinobi work. Night raids, disguises, false rumors, guides who knew paths regular soldiers couldn't follow. Surprise attacks that worked not because they were honorable, but because they were effective. And once those methods exist, you can't uninvent them. For the next centuries, Japan repeatedly fell into instability. Rival courts, feuding warlords, shifting alliances. In that chaos, intelligence became priceless. A lord who knew his enemy's plans could win without risking everything. A lord who didn't could lose his castle before he even understood the threat. This is the environment where covert specialists stop being an occasional convenience and become a necessity. And soon, two mountain regions, close to the heartland, yet stubbornly independent, begin to build a reputation that will echo for centuries: Iga and Kōka. Not because they were magical, but because they were prepared. In the next chapter, we will enter those mountains, where ordinary villages quietly became the most feared network of covert operators in feudal Japan. And once you see how they lived, you'll understand why the shadows learned to move like home. If you wanted to find the heart of shinobi culture in feudal Japan, you wouldn't start in the bright courtyards of Kyoto. You wouldn't begin in the grand castles of famous warlords, where banners snapped in the wind and reputations were carved into stone. You would go where power had trouble reaching. You would travel into the folds of central Honshu, into mountains that forced every traveler to slow down, to narrow their route, to expose themselves on winding passes. You'd leave the easy roads behind and enter country where valleys hide behind ridgelines, where fog can roll in like a curtain, and where the difference between lost and found is whether someone wants you to be seen. And sooner or later, you would arrive at two neighboring regions whose names became inseparable from a new kind of warfare: Iga and Kōka. Stand with me on a mountain pass around the year 1550. Below lies a basin that looks peaceful: rice fields, forests, small villages, a river cutting through green. From a distance, it could be any rural province in Japan. But the calm is deceptive. In these valleys, people grow up with a kind of knowledge that outsiders rarely possess. They know the paths that don't appear on maps. They know which stream beds stay quiet underfoot, which slopes hide movement at night, which ridges give you a view without giving you away. They know how to travel not as an army, but as a shadow. And just as important, they know how to organize. Because the shinobi weren't born only from terrain. They were born from a political structure unlike almost anywhere else in Japan. Most provinces were ruled by a single daimyo, a warlord with absolute authority. Orders flowed downward. Loyalty was enforced by hierarchy. Disobedience meant destruction. But Iga was different. Instead of one dominant lord, Iga was governed through a confederation of local warrior families. Lower-ranking landowning samurai, often described as jisamurai. These were not great nobles living far above the soil. They were men who worked their own land, defended their own villages, and understood their province the way a castle lord never could. Not as a possession, but as a living terrain. Power in Iga was distributed, negotiated, balanced. Decisions were shaped in councils, not dictated from a single throne. That mattered, because a confederation thinks differently than a kingdom. A centralized province fights by mass: armies, castles, siege lines, supply trains. A confederation survives by information, mobility, and coordination. You don't have one brain to protect, you have many. And when you're outnumbered by richer neighbors, you don't win by meeting them head-on. You win by knowing where they're going before they arrive. Across the mountains, Kōka developed a similar culture, also shaped by rugged terrain and strong local families, but with more access to outside contact. If Iga felt like a natural fortress, Kōka was a borderland. Closer to traffic, closer to politics, more entangled with the wider struggle of the Sengoku era. These were not wealthy provinces. Their mountains made large-scale farming difficult. Their people needed income beyond the harvest. And this is where the story becomes unmistakably practical. Iga and Kōka began selling specialized military services, not as fantasy assassins, as professionals. Warlords with money and ambition were constantly at war. Castles had to be taken. Supply lines had to be cut. Enemy movements had to be tracked. Messengers had to be intercepted. A single piece of intelligence could save a campaign or end one. So when a daimyo needed a job done quietly, the mountain provinces offered something rare. People trained not to be seen. At first, this wasn't a formal ninja tradition, the way later generations imagined it. It was a gradual specialization. Skills developed because the environment demanded them and the market rewarded them. Families trained their children in what the mountains taught naturally: endurance, climbing, swimming, navigating in darkness. They learned to recognize strangers and to disappear when threatened. They learned how to read patterns: when guards change shifts, which roads are busiest, which storehouses are guarded lightly, where rumors begin and how they spread. And because these regions were networks of families, not just isolated warriors, shinobi work was never truly solo. A man slipping into enemy territory might be the visible tip of a much larger system. Behind him stood villagers who knew who had passed through last week, merchants who overheard talk at a roadside inn, temple contacts who could hide someone for a night, local leaders who coordinated messages and ensured the right people knew what they needed to know without broadcasting it. This support structure is the part popular culture often forgets. Real covert operations don't rely on a single heroic figure. They rely on infrastructure, on quietly shared knowledge, on logistics, on networks that make movement possible. In Iga and Kōka, that infrastructure was communal, and it created a form of distributed resilience. If one family suffered losses, the entire system didn't collapse. If one operative failed, the province didn't lose its identity. Skills were redundant, spread across many lineages, refined in competition, strengthened by necessity. By the mid-15th century, these provinces had reputations, and reputations travel fast in wartime Japan. When daimyo needed intelligence gathered, a castle infiltrated, a plan sabotaged, or a message delivered through hostile territory, names like Iga and Kōka were spoken with equal parts respect and suspicion. Because hiring shinobi was admitting something uncomfortable, that honor alone wasn't enough to survive. And then the Sengoku period erupted fully, an age of shifting alliances and constant conflict, when trust was rare and betrayal common. In that kind of world, the demand for covert specialists didn't merely rise. It exploded, and the mountain families, who had been preparing for generations without calling it a legend, found themselves standing at the edge of history, about to become indispensable to Japan's most ambitious warlords. In the next chapter, we'll step even closer into the daily life of those villages, the structure of the clans, and the training that turned ordinary mountain children into operatives who could change the fate of castles without ever being seen. Imagine being born in Iga around the year 1540. Not into a palace, not into a famous samurai house with lacquered armor displayed like art. You're born into a village where the fields are small, the winters bite hard, and the mountains never let you forget who's in control. Your family farms. They trade. They argue about taxes and harvests like everyone else. And yet, beneath that ordinary life, there's another curriculum quietly unfolding. Because in Iga and Kōka, training didn't start with a ceremony. It started with childhood. The earliest lessons weren't taught with lectures. They were learned through play. Because play reveals instinct, and instinct is where you build the operative. Children play hide and seek in forests, not as a game of laughter, but as a school for concealment. They discover which leaves crunch underfoot, which branches betray weight, how a single careless step can echo in the quiet. They climb trees because trees are everywhere, and climbing becomes normal. Not a skill, not a trick, just another way to move. They run the hills until endurance becomes part of their body's default setting. They swim cold streams because the village's relationship with water isn't optional. If you live in these valleys, rivers are roads, moats are barriers, and sometimes water is the only place no one thinks to look. None of that sounds mystical. It sounds like rural life. That's the point. In the mountain provinces, daily life itself created raw material. But raw material isn't mastery. Around age 7 or 8, a more deliberate phase began. A teacher, often a father, uncle, older sibling, started shaping what the child already had. And this is where shinobi training begins to look shockingly modern. It was individualized. A child with a sharp mind might be guided toward observation, memory, planning. Learning how to notice details without staring, how to store information without writing it down. Another child with extraordinary coordination might be pushed toward climbing, silent movement, infiltration. A child who could talk easily, who could mimic speech and manners, might be steered toward disguise and persuasion. The goal wasn't to create identical warriors. The goal was to create reliable specialists, and then build teams where those specialists could combine. Every day began with conditioning. Running, short, explosive sprints, then longer distances that carved endurance into muscle. Shinobi had to move fast, over difficult terrain, sometimes for long stretches, and still be capable of action at the end. They didn't train to look strong. They trained to function. Jumping drills strengthened legs and taught control, how to clear an obstacle and land without noise, because noise isn't a minor mistake in covert work. Noise is a confession. Climbing started simple, trees, rough stone, obvious holds, and grew harder as technique improved. The purpose wasn't acrobatics. It was problem-solving in 3 dimensions. How do you ascend a wooden wall? How do you move on rooftops without silhouette? How do you carry gear while doing it? Balance training followed naturally. Narrow logs, beams, uneven stone edges. In a castle, the safest path might not be the ground. It might be a roof line, an attic beam, a narrow wall under darkness. Balance isn't skill there. It's survival. Swimming became more than swimming. They practiced endurance, underwater movement, quiet entry and exit. They learned to handle water while clothed because no one infiltrates in a swimsuit. They learned how to cross currents, how to use simple breathing tubes, how to stay low enough that a sentry's glance slides right over the surface. Then came the hardest thing to teach: silence. Silent movement is not just stepping lightly. It's awareness. You test surfaces. You distribute weight. You choose routes that minimize risk. You move at speeds that match your environment, not your ego. This required discipline. Every motion deliberate, every sound monitored. In shinobi training, the body becomes an instrument. The mind becomes a meter. Martial training was real, but it wasn't the center of the universe. Unlike samurai, who often trained for battlefield roles and recognized duels, shinobi prepared for unpredictable encounters. Unarmed combat mattered because a disguised operative couldn't always carry obvious weapons. Grappling mattered because fights might happen in tight corridors, in darkness, without room for sweeping sword strikes. Weapons training included swords, daggers, staffs, spears, chains, whatever could be used. But the philosophy wasn't prestige. A shinobi's weapon was a tool chosen for function, concealment, and context. And perhaps the most misunderstood part of their education wasn't physical at all. It was mental. Students practiced observation until it became automatic, learning to see patterns in guard routines, in traffic, in the rhythms of a place. They studied memory techniques because writing notes could get you killed. They learned what details matter, not just how many guards, but where they stand, when they rotate, what they're bored enough to ignore. Disguise training went deeper than costume. You learned how different classes moved, spoke, bowed, complained, joked. You learned what knowledge a merchant would naturally have, what a monk would say without thinking, what a farmer would notice first. You didn't pretend to be someone else. You became believable as someone else. And in that believability lies the real power. Because if you can pass as harmless, you don't need to hide in the shadows. You can walk through the front gate. That's the most frightening truth about real shinobi. Their greatest advantage wasn't invisibility. It was normality, weaponized. In the next part, we'll explore how those skills turned into a structured system, how entire villages became support networks, how roles were assigned, how information traveled, and why the shinobi were less like lone assassins and more like an intelligence service built from families. In popular culture, the ninja arsenal looks like a traveling weapon shop. Oversized shuriken, exotic blades, hidden spring-loaded contraptions, smoke bombs that work like magic, and a signature straight sword that no one else in Japan apparently owns. History tells a different story. Picture a small, dark storage room in Iga. An operative prepares for a mission the way a professional prepares, not with dramatic flair, but with quiet selection. This isn't about looking impressive. It's about getting home alive. The first lesson is simple. Everything must serve more than one purpose. A sword, yes, a sword, often comes first. But the idea of a standard ninja sword, short and straight with a square guard, is mostly a modern invention. Historical evidence for a single, distinctive ninja blade is thin. Real shinobi used what made sense for the mission, sometimes a standard katana, sometimes a shorter wakizashi, sometimes older straight-bladed forms. What mattered wasn't the design, it was the mindset. A samurai's sword was status, identity, honor made steel. A shinobi's sword was a tool, useful, replaceable, and, ideally, never drawn unless absolutely necessary. Even the scabbard could be part of the system. A hollow interior might hide documents, small tools, or powder. The scabbard could act as a short staff, extend reach, wedge a gap, or serve as an improvised aid in climbing and leverage. To the shinobi, nothing was just one thing. Daggers were essential because daggers disappear. The tanto was common, reliable, concealable. And then there's the kunai. one of the most misunderstood objects in ninja mythology. Modern media often treats it as a throwing weapon, like a Japanese combat dart. In reality, the kunai was primarily a tool, a trowel-like implement used for digging, prying, loosening mortar, cutting rope, and improvising entry. Could it be used as a weapon? Absolutely. Almost anything can, in skilled hands. But the shinobi approach was pragmatic. If you can carry a tool that also becomes a weapon, you've doubled your options. Now to the most famous item of all, shuriken. The movies present shuriken as lethal, perfectly accurate at long distance. Tiny stars that drop enemies instantly. Real shuriken were far less theatrical and far more tactical. They came in different types. Spike-like projectiles thrown like darts, and the star-shaped forms people recognize. But their purpose wasn't usually to kill. Thrown blades are hard to aim accurately beyond short range, and clothing can reduce serious injury. The shuriken's real power was psychological and momentary. A blade snapping towards someone's face forces a flinch. A flinch creates an opening. An opening creates escape or advantage. Shuriken were harassment weapons, distraction weapons, timing weapons. And timing is often the difference between success and capture. Then there was rope. So simple it's almost embarrassing how rarely it gets highlighted. Rope is one of the most versatile tools in covert work. Different lengths serve different missions. Climbing, binding, creating trip lines, setting traps, retrieving objects. A grappling hook, kaginawa, could turn an impossible wall into a solvable problem. But even this wasn't a miracle device. Hooks snag. Ropes creak. Climbing is slow and exhausting. It worked when used with planning and skill, not as a Hollywood shortcut. Climbing aids existed too. Hand claws, shuko, and foot claws, ashiko, could help grip wood, bark, certain surfaces. But they required practice. They could also betray you if they scraped or caught. Again, not magic, not guaranteed, just a tool that expands possibility in the right hands. Water was another constant challenge. Moats, rivers, canals. Castles were built to force attackers into predictable approaches, and water was one of the best barriers for that. Shinobi adapted with quiet practicality. Flotation aids, sealed containers, simple breathing tubes made from reeds or bamboo. The idea wasn't to walk on water, no matter what legends later claimed. It was to cross obstacles without turning yourself into a target. And then there's smoke. The phrase "vanished in a puff of smoke" didn't come from nothing. Smoke mixtures existed. Burn to create cover, to confuse, to break line of sight during retreat. Some formulas could irritate eyes and throats, turning pursuit into hesitation. But smoke wasn't a teleportation spell. Smoke works only if you already know where you're going next. A smoke device buys seconds. Preparation turns seconds into escape. Fire, though, fire was different. Fire could change the geometry of a fortress. Japanese castles and towns relied heavily on wood. A well-placed fire could cause panic, scatter defenders, force gates to open, draw guards away from key points. In that sense, fire was a weapon that scaled. One person could create chaos that looked like an army. Gunpowder arrived in Japan in the 16th century, and shinobi methods evolved with it. Improvised explosive containers, dangerous, unreliable, and risky to the user, could create diversions or start fires from a distance. Not clean grenades, like modern weapons, but early brutal tools that reflected a simple truth. Shinobi were not bound by tradition. They adopted what worked. They also carried the unglamorous essentials: basic first aid, simple medicines, bandages. Because covert work happens far from support. A small wound ignored becomes infection. An injury becomes death. Self-sufficiency wasn't heroic. It was required. And perhaps the most important equipment wasn't a weapon at all. It was disguise material. Clothing appropriate to roles. Props, documents, the small details that make a lie believable. A merchant's goods, a monk's beads, a farmer's tool. Because the best disguise isn't the one that looks right from 10 feet away. It's the one that holds up in conversation. Now, we should pause and name what shinobi didn't typically carry. They didn't wear theatrical black bodysuits in real life. Pure black often stands out in natural night shadows. Dark blues and browns blend better. They didn't haul an armory everywhere. An operative traveling in disguise couldn't carry obvious weapons without destroying their cover. And they didn't rely on gadgets to compensate for poor planning. Because the true shinobi advantage was never the tool. It was the system. Intelligence gathered ahead of time. Routes planned, escape options prepared, contingencies imagined. Tools were extensions of that preparation, not replacements for it. In the next part, we'll move from equipment to the most dangerous weapon the shinobi ever carried. One you can't confiscate, one you can't see on a belt. The weapon of identity, the art of deception. There's a reason the most effective shinobi weren't remembered for the battles they fought. They didn't want battles. A fight is loud. A fight leaves witnesses. A fight creates a story. And the shinobi's greatest weapon wasn't a blade or a bomb. It wasn't even stealth in the way movies imagine it. Their greatest weapon was something you can't hang on a wall. Perception. If you can control what people think they're seeing, you don't need to vanish into darkness. You can be visible without being noticed. Let's follow one operative on an intelligence mission. The target is a castle controlled by an enemy daimyo. The assignment is not glamorous. Learn the strength of the garrison, the condition of supplies, and the Lord's intentions for the coming season. The castle sits high and guarded. Approaching by stealth would be risky. Exposed ground, patrol routes, watchtowers. So the shinobi chooses a different path. They walk through the front gate. First comes identity selection. Shinobi traditions described common disguises, roles that granted plausible movement and access. Merchant, entertainer, farmer, servant, monk, ronin, yamabushi. Each disguise wasn't a costume. It was a social passport, a way to belong somewhere long enough to learn. For this mission, our operative chooses a particularly useful role. A wandering monk associated with the komuso tradition, recognized by a basket-like hat that covers the face. The hat is not suspicious. It's the point. In a society where most people show their identity openly, the komuso are one of the rare exceptions. A sanctioned public figure whose face is concealed as a sign of humility and detachment. In other words, the disguise comes with built-in camouflage. But a disguise isn't clothing. A disguise is knowledge. Before approaching the castle, the operative has prepared for weeks, learning mannerisms, vocabulary, etiquette. They can recite sutras without hesitation. They know how to bow and when. They understand how to speak to guards without sounding deferential enough to invite bullying or confident enough to raise alarms. They can play the shakuhachi flute well enough to be believable. Not to impress, but to avoid suspicion. When the operative approaches the gate, there is no nervousness in their posture. No urgency that betrays intent. They move like someone who expects to be seen, because they do. The guards challenge them. The operative responds calmly, softly, respectfully. Not with lies that sound like lies, with a story that fits the world. I travel, seeking alms, offering prayers, they might say. May I enter and receive the Lord's generosity? Most castles would allow it. Refusing religious supplicants could invite bad luck, spiritual blame, or local resentment. And what threat could a wandering monk possibly pose? The gate opens. Inside, the operative does not sneak around like a thief in a movie. They do something far more difficult. They behave normally. They linger where outsiders are allowed: outer courtyards, markets, service areas. They accept small offerings from servants and soldiers. They speak briefly, warmly, without pushing. They ask questions that aren't questions, because direct curiosity is dangerous. What is the garrison size? Would set off alarms instantly. But a comment like, "Your lord must command many men to keep such strong defenses," invites boasting. A sympathetic remark, "You soldiers must train very hard," invites complaint. And complaints are loaded with information: schedules, routines, morale, command structure, shortages. The shinobi collects fragments, not by forcing, by letting people volunteer. At the same time, they observe systematically, not in an obvious way, not staring, but counting in the mind, the number of guard posts visible at one time, how often patrols pass, which gates are used frequently and which are mostly ceremonial, where supplies are stored and whether the storage looks full or strained, whether soldiers appear confident or exhausted, whether weapons look maintained or neglected. This is not magic. It's discipline. A trained observer can learn enormous amounts simply by watching patterns, because humans repeat themselves. Organizations repeat themselves. Security repeats itself. Repetition is comfort, and comfort is vulnerability. Shinobi traditions describe different modes of intelligence work. One was passive collection, being present, appearing harmless, absorbing details. Another was active engagement, creating situations that reveal information. Active engagement required psychology, building rapport, making someone feel heard, sharing a small joke, finding common ground. The shinobi understood that most people don't guard secrets like a vault. They guard them like a habit, until emotion interrupts the habit. Pride makes people boast. Anger makes people careless. Fear makes people cooperative. Greed makes people bargain. None of this is romantic. It's human. A good operative didn't just manipulate individuals, they could also manipulate the environment. Rumors were tools. Disinformation could create confusion. A whisper about reinforcements could cause a lord to retreat. A suggestion that a trusted advisor was disloyal could fracture a command structure. Done well, the lie doesn't sound like propaganda. It sounds like something everyone is saying. But deception was also dangerous for the shinobi. If captured, the consequence wasn't imprisonment. It was interrogation, torture, execution. So they trained defensively too. How to maintain a cover story, how to keep details consistent, how to appear harmless under pressure. Some accounts suggest operatives carried poison for suicide if capture was inevitable. Not as melodrama, but as a brutal understanding. Everyone breaks eventually. And compromise could kill more than one person. Female operatives, often called kunoichi in later tradition, used different access routes. In a world where spaces were gendered, women could enter areas men could not. Inner quarters, households, private domestic networks. They could work as servants, seamstresses, entertainers, building long-term proximity that produced deep intelligence. The seductress assassin stereotype is not entirely invented, but it's wildly overstated. Sexuality was one tool among many, and not the core of the work. Because the core of the work was the same for everyone. control what others believe. In the end, the operative leaves the castle the same way they entered, openly, calmly, without running. Later, in a safe place, they write down what they saw, reconstructing the fortress in the mind. Routines, strengths, weaknesses, human faults, and their employer receives something far more valuable than a kill. They receive knowledge. In the next chapter, we'll watch what happens when this invisible craft is applied at scale. When a small team uses fire, timing, and panic to crack what an army cannot. We'll step onto the battlefield and see how shadows can decide the fate of castles. A siege is a slow, hungry thing. Armies surround walls. They cut roads. They wait. They starve defenders out. If the defenders don't starve them first, it's a contest of patience, logistics, and morale. And for weeks, sometimes months, nothing seems to change. Then, on a single night, everything changes at once. Picture a castle under siege in the early Sengoku period. Torches flickering, watchmen pacing, defenders exhausted but still confident. The walls are thick, the gates barred, the stores adequate. The besieging lord has thrown men at the problem before and failed. Direct assault is costly. A long blockade risks reinforcements arriving. Time is the enemy. So the lord turns to another kind of solution. Not a larger army, a smaller one. A hand-picked team from the mountain provinces. Operatives trained not to win battles, but to break assumptions. They don't bring siege towers. They bring knowledge. Guard routines, weak points, the location of storehouses, and what panic will do to human beings when smoke rises in the wrong place. This is how shinobi influence history. Not as lone assassins performing dramatic kills, but as specialists who turn a fortified position into a confused one. The basic pattern repeats across accounts and traditions. 1. Study the target. 2. Identify the pressure point. 3. Create chaos. 4. Exploit the moment. 5. Disappear. On a moonless night, a team splits into smaller pairs. One group moves toward stables, another toward food stores, another toward wooden structures that will burn fast. They carry simple ignition materials, things that don't look like weapons until they're used. Near midnight, flames rise from multiple points. Not one fire, many. The defenders' minds do what minds always do under sudden crisis. They narrow. They rush. They abandon plan for reaction. They leave posts to fight fires. They shout conflicting orders. They run to protect what feels most urgent. Horses, food, the Lord's residence, often leaving the gate less guarded than it has been in weeks. That's the real weapon. Not the fire, but the rearrangement of attention. While defenders scramble, another operative reaches the gate. Bars can be loosened, locks can be manipulated. A guard might be distracted, bribable, or simply absent at the wrong time. And when the gate opens even slightly, when the impossible suddenly becomes possible, the waiting army outside pours in. By dawn, a fortress that resisted weeks of siege falls in a few hours, not by strength, by timing. This is the kind of story that became shinobi legend, not because it was supernatural, but because it was deeply unsettling. It suggested that walls don't guarantee safety, that an army can be defeated not by meeting it, but by unmaking its confidence. And in the Sengoku period, confidence was currency. Now we meet a name that stands at the intersection of history and myth. Hattori Hanzo. In later popular culture, Hanzo becomes almost superhuman, an onmyoji-like figure, a demon commander, a man who appears and disappears like smoke. History is less dramatic, but more consequential. Hanzo was a warrior, and commander connected to Iga traditions, serving the Matsudaira, later known as the Tokugawa. His role wasn't to single-handedly infiltrate castles like a movie hero. His importance lies in something far more strategic. He commanded and coordinated shinobi assets, networks, scouts, guides, operatives, on behalf of a rising power. And his most famous moment reflects exactly what shinobi were best at: moving through danger when the obvious routes are closed. In 1582, Japan is shaken by a political earthquake. Oda Nobunaga, one of the era's most powerful warlords, is betrayed and killed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. In the chaos that follows, alliances tremble. Enemy territory becomes suddenly hostile. Roads that were safe yesterday become death traps today. Tokugawa Ieyasu, Nobunaga's ally, is far from home, deep in dangerous territory with only a small escort. If he is captured or killed, his clan's future may end right there. This is not a battlefield problem. It's an extraction problem. And extraction is a shinobi specialty. Hanzo plans an escape route through the mountainous region of Iga, terrain where local knowledge is as valuable as an army. Connections matter here: safe houses, guides, paths that avoid checkpoints, villages that know how to hide strangers, and routes that look like nothing to outsiders. The journey is brutal. Fast movement, constant risk, search parties, uncertain loyalties. But the escort makes it through. Tokugawa survives. And that survival changes Japanese history. Because Tokugawa Ieyasu will eventually rise to unify the country and establish the Tokugawa shogunate. More than 2 centuries of peace and centralized rule. If he dies on that road, the entire arc of Japan's future bends in a different direction. This is a key point that's easy to miss. Shinobi influence is often invisible in the final record. The decisive act isn't always a dramatic victory. It's the quiet success that keeps a leader alive, keeps a plan intact, keeps a war from being lost before it starts. But shinobi success also carried a price. When a group becomes known for its capabilities, it becomes a target. Iga's independence and reputation made it intolerable to unifiers like Oda Nobunaga. And in the late 1570s and early 1580s, this tension snaps, bringing one of the most important turning points in shinobi history: the invasions of Iga. In the next part, we'll watch that confrontation unfold. First, the surprising defense, then the overwhelming retaliation. Because no matter how skilled the shadows are, there are moments when sheer force floods the mountains. There's a dangerous moment in every hidden tradition, the moment when it becomes famous. For years, Iga's greatest protection wasn't just its mountains. It was its relative obscurity. It was a place powerful warlords passed around rather than through. A basin ringed by ridges, guarded by narrow passes. Sustained by local families who governed themselves and sold their specialized services carefully. But in the Sengoku period, nothing stays quiet forever. By the late 1570s, Oda Nobunaga's campaign to unify Japan is swallowing provinces like wildfire. He is not merely expanding, he is standardizing, bringing regions under a single authority, turning independent centers of power into obedient parts of a larger machine. And in that worldview, an autonomous province like Iga is intolerable. Not because it is wealthy, because it is uncontrollable. Iga's confederation refuses to submit like a normal province. It doesn't have a single daimyo to intimidate or replace. It's a network, families, councils, alliances, embedded in terrain that punishes outsiders. So the Oda move begins. In 1579, Nobunaga's son, Oda Nobukatsu, leads an invasion into Iga. Contemporary numbers vary, but the exact figure matters less than the imbalance. A conventional force marching into unconventional country. An army enters expecting roads. Iga gives them ravines, expecting open ground. Iga gives them forests and narrow passes where numbers become useless. The invaders push into valleys and discover what shinobi-style warfare looks like when it's defensive, not covert. Ambushes strike from elevation. Attackers appear, inflict damage, then withdraw before a decisive engagement can form. Traps turn pursuit into chaos. Rocks and logs tumble down slopes. Arrows and sudden attacks fragment formations. It's not a glorious battle. It's an erosion. And that is precisely what conventional forces hate most. Because you can't win against erosion by charging. You can only endure it, and endurance breaks morale. Samurai trained for set-piece clashes and castle assaults struggle here. The enemy refuses to meet them in the open. They can't identify a main force to destroy. They can't secure territory without bleeding for every step. Casualties rise, confusion grows. And eventually, Nobukatsu retreats, humiliated. For Iga, it is a victory. A small confederation has defended itself against a larger force through terrain mastery and irregular tactics. But victories can be loud, and loud victories attract the most dangerous kind of attention. Because Oda Nobunaga does not accept humiliation, he does not interpret Iga's defense as local resilience. He interprets it as defiance, an insult to the logic of unification. And for a unifier, defiance is contagious. If Iga survives independent, other regions will believe they can too. So Nobunaga prepares a different kind of response, not an invasion, an eradication. In 1581, he personally leads a massive multi-pronged assault into Iga. Accounts suggest an overwhelming force entering from several directions at once. The strategy is brutally simple. Deny Iga the advantage of controlling the entrances. The mountains that once protected the province now become a cage. When an enemy comes through one pass, you can focus your defense. When they come through many, your defenders thin out like stretched rope. Iga's strengths, distributed families, decentralized leadership, local terrain knowledge, remain real. Ambushes still work, harassment still hurts. But the scale changes the equation. Guerrilla tactics excel at cutting an army's edges. They struggle when an army becomes a flood. Nobunaga's forces advance systematically. Villages burn. Fields are destroyed. Resistance is hunted and punished. Some Iga fighters die in open battle when forced. Others die defending their homes. Some families attempt to negotiate surrender. Others flee into the mountains, only to find that mountains are less a sanctuary when exits are blocked. This is where the romantic image of shinobi meets the reality of power. Skill matters, but skill cannot always overcome overwhelming force applied without restraint. By the end of the campaign, Iga, as an independent stronghold, collapses. The confederation is broken. Survivors scatter across Japan. Some are absorbed into the service of other lords, including Tokugawa. Some disappear into civilian life, returning to farming and trade, carrying their knowledge quietly rather than publicly. In a cruel irony, Nobunaga's destruction of Iga does not erase shinobi methods. It spreads them, because scattered specialists become seeds. They carry techniques into new domains. They train new operatives. They shift from a regional network to a distributed resource embedded within the armies and administrations of bigger powers. But something is lost in that scattering too. Iga's strength wasn't merely individual skill. It was the community infrastructure. Villages where support was natural, where networks were local, where training culture was reinforced by daily life. When people scatter, that ecosystem breaks. Shinobi work becomes more formalized under major rulers, more controlled, less autonomous. It becomes a tool of the state rather than a service offered by independent provinces. And this shift matters, because the next phase of Japanese history will create a new paradox. The very rulers who used shinobi methods to win will soon build a peace that makes those methods far less necessary. In the next chapter, we'll step into the final great conflicts where shinobi still matter, like Osaka Castle, before the Tokugawa order settles in, because the age of constant war is ending, and with it, the profession born from chaos begins its long twilight. The year is 1615. Smoke still hangs over the ruins of Osaka Castle, and the last great resistance to Tokugawa power collapses into ash. After generations of civil war, Japan enters something that feels almost impossible to people who have known only chaos: stability. For farmers, it means planting without armies marching through the fields. For merchants, it means roads that no longer shift with every betrayal. For families, it means sons who might actually come home. But for the shinobi, whose entire profession was shaped by war, peace is not relief. Peace is unemployment. During the Sengoku era, a daimyo's survival depended on intelligence. Who was allied with whom, what routes an enemy planned, which castles were weak, which commanders could be bribed or turned. Shinobi were hired because the world was uncertain. Tokugawa rule is built to reduce uncertainty. One central authority, one dominant order. A system designed to make large-scale conflict difficult, costly, and rare. When the political landscape hardens into stability, the need for covert specialists shrinks dramatically. Yet Tokugawa does not simply discard shinobi. He is too pragmatic for that. Some Iga and Kōka operatives, especially those who supported Tokugawa's rise, are absorbed into official service. They receive stipends, ranks, and assignments. But what those assignments become reveals the true nature of the transition. Many shinobi are turned into gate guards. Not infiltrators slipping through enemy walls, guards standing beside Tokugawa's walls, checking credentials in broad daylight. Others become fire watchers in Edo, a city of wood and paper where flames can race through neighborhoods like wind. Their climbing and agility make them useful in emergency response. Reaching rooftops, rescuing people, coordinating bucket lines. Some are used in law enforcement, tracking criminals, investigating theft, maintaining order. All of these jobs matter. Some are even honorable, but they are not what shinobi were built for. Imagine modern special forces, operators trained for high-risk missions, reassigned to stand watch at office entrances for the rest of their lives. Their skills don't disappear overnight, but without real use, the sharp edge dulls. That's what peace does. It doesn't defeat shinobi. It makes them irrelevant. The economic shift hits fast. In wartime, shinobi could supplement income through mission payments, success-based, often lucrative, sometimes dangerous. In peacetime, a stipend becomes the main support, and it's not always generous. Families take side work, farming, crafts, small trade. Less training, less practice, less time for the skills that once required constant sharpening. Social hierarchy also hardens. During war, effectiveness outranks etiquette. A lord values the agent who delivers results, even if the method violates ideals of honor. In peace, the old ideals return like a tide. The samurai class, now bureaucratized and institutionalized, often looks down on covert methods. Shinobi occupy an uncomfortable in-between, connected to lower-ranking samurai origins, yet not respected as proper warriors. Their very usefulness during war becomes a stain in peacetime morality. And perhaps the deepest problem is generational. A boy born in the 1620s grows up in a world without missions. He can be taught techniques, how to climb, how to move quietly, how to conceal tools, but he doesn't learn the most important part, the reality of consequence. He never feels the pressure of a guard's footsteps near his hiding place. He never has to keep a cover story intact while fear rises in the throat. He never learns which techniques work only on paper and which survive contact with the real world. As decades pass, practice becomes stylized. Techniques turn into forms. Forms turn into rituals. Rituals preserve motion, but they don't preserve purpose. It's in this atmosphere, this fear that knowledge is evaporating, that we see one of the most important artifacts in shinobi history, the manuals. In 1696, Fujibayashi Yasutake compiles the Bansenshūkai, often described as the most comprehensive surviving ninja manual. The timing matters. It's written long after the main operational period, when veterans are dying and first-hand experience is fading. The motivation is almost mournful. Write it down before it's lost. The Bansenshūkai doesn't read like a book of magic. It reads like a professional handbook. Philosophy, organization, observation, infiltration, tools, fire techniques, survival, even sections shaped by the natural philosophy of the era. It draws on Chinese military thought, Sun Tzu's emphasis on deception, intelligence, and winning without direct confrontation. Its value is enormous because it offers an internal lens, how practitioners and their descendants framed their work. But it also has limits. A manual can describe technique. It cannot fully capture the lived experience, the stress, the improvisation, the fear management, the countless tiny judgments that separate success from catastrophe. As the Tokugawa centuries stretch on, many shinobi descendants fold into ordinary life. The old community infrastructure that supported covert operations dissolves. The mountains remain, but they are no longer training grounds. They are simply mountains again. And then comes the 19th century. Modernization, the end of the old order, the abolition of the samurai class itself. Whatever lingering vestiges remained are swept away by a new Japan that measures power in factories and railroads, not hereditary warrior roles. By the time the modern era fully arrives, the shinobi as an active profession are gone. But here is the strange twist. As the real shinobi vanish, the legendary shinobi grow stronger. Because in peacetime, people have space for nostalgia, for theater, for stories. And the shinobi, already wrapped in secrecy, become perfect raw material for imagination. In the next chapter, we'll watch the transformation happen. How stage conventions created the black suit. How practical deception became supernatural invisibility. How history turned into myth. And why that myth, once born, proved almost impossible to kill. Imagine an Edo period theater, sometime in the mid-1700s. Outside, the city is orderly. The Tokugawa peace has held for generations. Most people alive have never seen the kind of civil war that shaped their grandparents' world. Life is still hard, but it is stable in a way that once seemed impossible. And stability changes what people crave. When danger is daily reality, stories are warnings. When danger is distant memory, stories become entertainment. Inside the theater, lantern light washes over an audience eager for spectacle. A dramatic scene unfolds. A hero faces an impossible task. A villain hides behind defenses, and the plot demands a miracle. Then, figures appear on stage dressed entirely in black. They move unnaturally fast. They climb walls. They strike from nowhere. They vanish through trap doors and hidden passages. Their weapons flash like stars. They seem less like people and more like a force of nature. Mysterious, unstoppable, almost supernatural. These are not the historical shinobi. They are the theatrical ninja. And this is where one of the most famous ninja truths is born. The all-black costume. In kabuki theater, stagehands called kuroko wore black from head to toe. The audience understood the convention. Black meant, ignore this person. The kuroko were functionally invisible, not because of magic, but because the performance trained viewers to see them as part of the stage. It's an astonishing idea when you think about it. Invisibility created by expectation. When playwrights dressed ninja characters like kuroko, the effect was immediate and powerful. Suddenly, ninja weren't just stealthy. They were theatrically invisible, present in plain sight and yet unseen. It was clever. It was dramatic. It was never meant as documentary. But over time, that image escaped the stage. And once an image escapes into popular imagination, it doesn't obey footnotes. The same process happened with ninja powers. Kabuki used stage machinery, wires, trap doors, quick costume changes, to create effects that looked like flying, vanishing, transformation. Audiences knew they were watching theater. But repeated exposure creates expectation. Expectation becomes belief. Belief becomes what everyone knows. Meanwhile, printed literature explodes. Edo Japan becomes increasingly literate, and publishers feed demand for stories set in the old age of war, an era now safely distant, exciting without being dangerous. Writers draw from history, then stretch it. A real shinobi starts a fire that causes chaos. The story retells it. The shinobi summons magical flame. A real operative infiltrates a castle using disguise and patience. The story retells it. The ninja shapeshifts into an animal. A real team escapes using smoke and pre-planned routes. The story retells it. They vanish into thin air. And with every retelling, the shinobi move farther from the human world and closer to myth. This transformation isn't random. It has predictable fuel. First, loss of first-hand knowledge. As the last veterans die, fewer people can say, that's not how it was. Gaps open in public memory, and imagination fills them. Second, commercial incentive. Publishers and theater owners learn quickly. Realistic infiltration is impressive, but supernatural ninja sell more tickets. Third, psychological need. In a stable society, people still hunger for conflict. Controlled conflict, safe conflict. Ninja become a perfect vessel. Figures from a violent past who can embody danger without threatening the present. Fourth, archetype. The ninja legend maps neatly onto universal storytelling needs. The underdog who defeats power through cunning, the outsider who operates beyond rules, the master of secret knowledge. History becomes raw material for meaning. And then specific figures grow into towering legends. Hattori Hanzo, a historically important commander, becomes, depending on the story, an almost demonic guardian of Tokugawa power. A man with unnatural abilities. His human skill turns into superhuman myth because the myth better serves drama. Ishikawa Gomen, likely a real outlaw executed in 1594, evolves into a legendary ninja thief, part rebel hero, part Robin Hood, credited with impossible feats and moral symbolism. Other names, some historical, some possibly invented, join the pantheon. Colossal warriors, animal masters, phantom assassins. The details vary, but the direction is consistent. Human becomes more than human. Even practical shinobi practices get rewritten. Careful, silent walking becomes literal invisibility. Disguise and acting become magical transformation. Climbing training becomes gravity-defying wall walking. Herbal knowledge becomes alchemy. Hand seals, once likely mnemonic and focusing tools, become sorcery, gestures that summon storms and fire. In the peaceful Tokugawa world, the ninja become what the public wants them to be. Not professionals, but fantasies. Danger contained in costume, violence stylized into art. By the 1800s, the ninja are already more legend than history. And then something else happens. A second transformation, even larger. When the modern world discovers ninja, it doesn't meet the historical shinobi first. It meets the legend. Because by the time the West encounters the concept in the 20th century, the theatrical and literary ninja have had more than a century of cultural momentum. The myth has become the default. And once a myth goes global, it becomes harder than ever to untangle. In the next chapter, we'll move into the documentary evidence, the surviving manuals, the writings that preserve a more grounded view of shinobi work. We'll look at what texts like the Bansenshūkai actually say, what they don't say, and why those omissions matter. Because if you want to find the real shinobi, you don't start on a stage. You start in ink. If theater created the ninja the world imagines, then the surviving manuals are our best chance of meeting the ninja who actually lived. Not the black-clad phantom, not the sorcerer with supernatural seals, not the lone assassin with a mythic blade, but the professional, trained, methodical, and painfully human. Somewhere in Japan, preserved through generations like a family heirloom, rests a document compiled in 1676, a massive collection of knowledge known as the Bansenshūkai, often translated as something like a sea of many rivers, suggesting a convergence of streams into one body of water. That metaphor matters, because the Bansenshūkai isn't one person's invention. It's a synthesis, an attempt to gather scattered traditions, methods, and principles before they vanish. And the timing is crucial. By 1676, the great age of shinobi operations is already in the past. The Tokugawa peace has held for decades. Veterans of sengoku conflicts are old or dying. The conditions that forged shinobi, constant war, shifting loyalties, the need for covert action, are gone. So why write the manual then? Because the compiler understood something harsh. Skills without use die quickly, and knowledge transmitted only by memory can disappear in a single generation. The Bansenshūkai begins not with spells, but with philosophy. And that alone tells us something important. It draws heavily on older military thinking, including Chinese strategy, emphasizing deception, intelligence, and winning through information rather than force. It frames shinobi work as a strategic necessity, not a rogue art. That's not just academic posturing, it's a kind of defense. In a society where honor is a public virtue, covert work is morally awkward. Manuals like this often try to justify the profession, not as dishonorable trickery, but as essential service in war. Then come sections that modern audiences sometimes mistake as mysticism. Cosmology, yin-yang concepts, timing, and natural observation. But much of it can be read as early attempts at practical planning, seasonal patterns, weather reading, celestial navigation, and choosing timing that reduces risk. The language can sound mystical because it comes from a world where science and philosophy weren't cleanly separated. But underneath, you can see an operative mindset. Predict what you can. Reduce chance. Stack the odds. The manual also addresses something rarely highlighted in ninja fantasy. Organization. How to assign roles. How to evaluate reliability. How to structure teams for specific missions. How to maintain secrecy within a group. Because in covert work, the enemy isn't just outside you. It's inside you too. Loose talk, ego, jealousy, fear. This is one of the most modern aspects of historical shinobi practice. They understood that operations fail as often from human weakness as from enemy strength. And then the Bansenshūkai moves into the core, intelligence gathering. Not in cinematic terms, but in categories. Strategic information, operational movement, tactical details. Methods for collecting, verifying, and transmitting information safely. How to evaluate sources. How to distinguish rumor from fact. That last piece is critical, because in the sengoku world, rumor could be weaponized by shinobi and against them. The infiltration and movement sections are often remarkably grounded. They describe climbing approaches, ways to move quietly, ways to approach and withdraw, how to exploit terrain. You don't find pages about turning invisible. You find pages about how hard it is not to be seen, and how discipline is the only real solution. Combat appears, but it is notably not glorified. This is one of the best corrections to modern misunderstanding. In many manuals, combat is treated like a contingency, something you prepare for, but something you prefer to avoid. Because fighting is risk. Risk is exposure. Exposure is failure. Then come the tools. Ropes, entry implements, signaling, disguise materials, again, practical. The manual mindset is consistent. The point is not to carry exotic gadgets. The point is to prepare intelligently and carry what expands your options without compromising cover. And yes, there are sections on fire, smoke, and gunpowder techniques. That doesn't make the shinobi demons. It makes them adaptive. As new technology entered Japan, professionals incorporated it. They didn't worship tradition. They used what worked. But here's the key detail that often surprises people. The manuals do not read like books of supernatural secrets. No spells. No claims of magical power. No instructions for walking on water. That absence is loud. Because if shinobi truly possessed supernatural methods, a manual written to preserve the tradition, at the very moment knowledge is feared to be slipping away, would be exactly where you'd expect them. Instead, you get something else. A window into a profession that depended on training, psychology, planning, and discipline. Of course, we have to be careful. The Bansenshūkai is invaluable, but it is not a perfect time machine. It is compiled after the peak era of operations. It reflects one person's attempt to synthesize multiple traditions. Some information may be idealized, simplified, or influenced by the cultural expectations of the Tokugawa era. Some details could be omitted deliberately, either because they were considered too dangerous, too secret, or simply too hard to explain. And there's another limitation. Manuals can preserve theory, but not always practice. A text can tell you that locks can be picked. It cannot give you the feel of the mechanism, the patience required, the risk of a creak in silence. It can describe disguise, but it cannot fully transmit the lived skill of becoming another person under pressure. Still, these documents matter because they ground the shinobi story in something more reliable than stagecraft or legend. They give scholars something to test against other evidence. Payment records, battlefield accounts, domain documents, provincial histories. They give historians a framework to separate what is plausible from what is theatrical. And they give us today a clearer picture of the real shinobi. Not supernatural beings, but specialists who mastered the hardest battlefield of all, the human mind. In the next chapter, we'll follow that trail into the modern era. How Japan rediscovers ninja history, how tourism and martial arts revive the image, sometimes carefully, sometimes commercially, and how the world's most famous shadow warriors rise again in a completely new form. The year is 1910. Japan is no longer the closed, feudal world of the Tokugawa shogunate. Railroads cut across the islands. Factories rise. The military modernizes with Western organization and weapons. The country has shocked the world, defeating China in 1895, then defeating Russia in 1905, becoming the first Asian nation in the modern era to defeat a major European power. Japan is changing so quickly that the past begins to feel like a foreign country. And when a nation moves that fast, something predictable happens. It looks back. Early 20th century scholars start studying Japan's history with new rigor, collecting documents, analyzing regional archives, interviewing elders, trying to map legend onto evidence. Among the subjects that pull them in is the ninja, not the theatrical ninja, the historical one. Because by this point, ninja exists in multiple layers. The kabuki figure, the popular novel hero, the whispered folklore character. But scholars find something that matters more than any story. Records, mentions in sengoku documents, payments for covert services, references in war chronicles, local traditions that align with political realities in central Honshu. The scholarship doesn't solve every mystery. Sources are limited, and secrecy was part of the profession. But it establishes a basic truth beyond serious doubt. Shinobi were real. They were employed. They mattered. And this scholarly revival produces an unexpected second effect. It creates opportunity. Places like Iga and Kōka, once legendary heartlands, now relatively quiet rural regions, recognize that they have something unique in a modernizing Japan. Industry may not be their strength, but heritage can be. So the old valleys begin to market the old shadows. Museums appear. Exhibits display tools, replicas, and surviving documents. Ninja houses are built or curated. Homes with hidden doors, concealed compartments, escape routes, architectural tricks that suggest an environment designed for defense and evasion. Festivals emerge. Demonstrations draw tourists. Local pride grows. But this revival immediately runs into a problem that never goes away. Tourists don't pay for nuance. Most visitors don't arrive expecting a careful lecture about espionage logistics and village confederations. They arrive expecting the ninja they already know. The black suit, the acrobatics, the shuriken that lands perfectly, the smoke bomb vanish. So places like Iga and Kōka face a constant tension. Teach history or sell fantasy. Some presentations try to do both, blending education with spectacle. Others lean heavily into entertainment. And once the entertainment version becomes profitable, it tends to dominate, even when educators push back. This tension doesn't only shape tourism, it shapes martial arts too. Because as Japan enters the modern era, interest in traditional fighting systems grows, both as cultural preservation and as personal discipline. Some families claim they preserved shinobi-related arts through the Tokugawa centuries into the Meiji period and beyond. Some martial schools present themselves as direct continuations of old traditions, kept alive quietly when the profession itself disappeared. But authenticity here is difficult. Shinobi weren't a centralized organization with clear public records. Their lineages are scattered and often private. Some documents were lost, some were never written down. And modern people, like people in every age, sometimes claim heritage for status, legitimacy, or business. So scholars and practitioners argue, Which schools represent genuine transmission? Which are reconstructions? Which are modern inventions inspired by old ideas? One name becomes central in this debate. Takamatsu Toshitsugu, 1887-1972. Takamatsu claimed extensive training under masters of multiple traditional schools, including lineages presented as connected to shinobi traditions. He was clearly a skilled martial artist with broad knowledge, but some of his historical claims are contested. Documentary evidence for certain lineages is debated or thin, and the boundary between preserved tradition and assembled system can be blurry. Yet, whatever the academic disputes, Takamatsu's influence is undeniable, because his teaching passes to one of the most famous figures in modern ninjutsu, Hatsumi Masaki, born 1931. Hatsumi founds the Bujinkan, teaching what he presents as ninjutsu-based training drawn from multiple schools. The organization spreads internationally, and for many outside Japan, Bujinkan becomes the gateway to ninjutsu in the modern world. Supporters see it as living tradition, adapted for modern times, but rooted in something older. Skeptics see it as a modern martial art with historical inspiration, not a pure line to sengoku shinobi practice. And both positions contain a truth. Because even if you had a perfect lineage, the modern context changes everything. Training for battlefield infiltration in feudal Japan is not the same as training for self-defense in a modern city. The goals shift, the environment shifts, the pressure shifts. So modern ninjutsu becomes a wide ecosystem. Some schools emphasize historical reconstruction and careful scholarship. Others emphasize practical modern defense. Others lean into theatrical performance. The label ninjutsu becomes, in many places, a marketing term as much as a technical category. Meanwhile, academic study continues in Japan. Historians refine understanding, separating what can be verified from what remains uncertain. They examine manuals like the Bansenshūkai, alongside provincial documents, war records, and socio-political structures of Iga and Kōka. They paint a picture that is less cinematic, but more impressive because it's real. At the same time, popular culture accelerates ninja fascination again. Manga, films, television, later anime and video games. Ninja become a flexible icon. Sometimes historical, sometimes fantastical, sometimes comedic, sometimes heroic. And Japan's tourism agencies recognize the global power of the image. Ninja become part of the country's cultural brand, alongside samurai, geisha, and other exported symbols. But that raises the final question of this modern revival. Is the ninja being preserved or exploited? The answer, like most history, is complicated. Some museums teach carefully. Some festivals prioritize spectacle. Some martial schools pursue integrity. Others chase myth. Often they coexist side by side in the same town, feeding off the same name. And then the West enters the story in full. Because once ninja become global, the legend doesn't just spread, it mutates. In the next chapter, we'll watch how Hollywood and Western pop culture discover the ninja, what they do to the image, why the 1980s become a ninja boom, and how the shadow warrior transforms from Japanese historical specialist into a worldwide archetype. For most of the world, ninja didn't arrive through a history book. It arrived through a screen. In the mid-20th century, Japan's ninja legends, already shaped by kabuki and popular fiction, begin leaking into Western imagination. But the moment that plants the seed for millions is cinematic. A world-famous spy film that frames Japan as mysterious, beautiful, and dangerous. A Western hero stands among black-clad warriors on rooftops. Exotic weapons glint. Training looks secret ancient, almost mystical. The details are fantasy, but the effect is real. Audiences leave with a new idea. Japan produced shadow warriors called ninja. At first, the concept is more curiosity than obsession. But cultural conditions shift in the 1970s. The West develops a hunger for Asian martial arts. Bruce Lee's impact is enormous. Suddenly, hand-to-hand combat feels like philosophy, discipline, identity. Martial arts schools spread. The public is primed for a new archetype. Then the 1980s hit, and something detonates. Ninja become a phenomenon. Low-budget action films help ignite it. They aren't documentaries. They aren't subtle. But they understand the formula Western audiences love. Hidden masters, secret training, exotic weapons, dramatic revenge plots. Ninja are presented as almost superhuman, fast, silent, unstoppable, wearing the now iconic black suit and mask. The key is that the films don't need historical accuracy. They need a feeling, competence under pressure. Ninja stories deliver that like nothing else. They offer an adult version of a childhood fantasy. The idea that with enough training, you can become capable of anything, prepared for any threat, master of any environment. Hollywood amplifies this into a stereotype that becomes instantly recognizable. Black costume and face covering, shuriken thrown with perfect accuracy. A sword as signature identity. Acrobatics that border on impossible. Disappear techniques that feel supernatural. Secret clans and shadowy organizations. None of this is real shinobi, but it is culturally powerful, and it spreads fast. Television joins in, sometimes seriously, sometimes as imitation. But the most influential ninja property of that era is not a gritty action show. It's a cartoon. 4 mutated turtles, a rat master, a sewer hideout, a love of pizza. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles turns ninja into something playful and heroic for children worldwide. The connection to historical Japan is essentially zero. Yet for an entire generation, ninja becomes synonymous with coolness, discipline, teamwork, and martial arts excellence, packaged in bright colors and jokes. That matters more than accuracy, because cultural meaning isn't made by historians. It's made by repetition. Video games accelerate the myth at the exact moment interactive media begins to dominate youth culture. Ninja are perfect protagonists for games. They justify speed, stealth, climbing, weapon variety, and high-stakes missions. Titles featuring ninja characters make the archetype feel personal, no longer something you watch, but something you are. The result is a feedback loop. Films tell you ninja are extraordinary. Games let you feel extraordinary, and toys let you carry that feeling into daily life. Commercial products follow the wave. Costumes, plastic shuriken, comic books, lunchboxes, ninja training kits. The word ninja enters marketing language as shorthand for elite skill. Code ninja, marketing ninja, ninja mode. The term breaks free from Japan entirely. And here's the strange part. As the ninja becomes universal, it becomes less Japanese. The Western ninja transforms into a global action archetype, like a cowboy or a pirate. The details become interchangeable. The ninja might appear in futuristic cyberpunk settings, fantasy worlds, or modern cities. The cultural origin becomes aesthetic rather than historical.
That transformation has consequences. On the positive side, ninja fascination becomes an entry point. Some Western fans move from movies to real interest in Japanese history, language, and culture. Martial arts schools expand. Certain traditions, like the Bujinkan and other organizations, grow internationally, offering structured training and philosophy. But there are also distortions. Western portrayals often amplify mystical East tropes, exoticism, secret knowledge, inscrutable masters, supernatural techniques. Japan becomes less a complex society and more a stage backdrop for fantasy. And in some cases, ninja stories drift into uncomfortable narratives where a Western protagonist learns the secret art and surpasses native practitioners, an echo of broader cultural patterns that flatten or appropriate. So the global ninja is both appreciation and projection. It's fascination and misunderstanding. It's a symbol that inspires discipline, while also carrying stereotypes that obscure the real history behind it. By the 1990s, the initial boom cools. Ninja are no longer everywhere, but they never disappear. They stay embedded, appearing in new films, new games, new comics, new anime that sweep global audiences. The legend adapts because it's flexible. And that brings us to the final question. If the ninja the world knows is not the historical shinobi, then what remains true? In the next chapter, we'll do the final accounting, separating myth from fact, not to ruin the legend, but to sharpen it. Because the real shinobi story isn't less interesting than the fantasy. It's more unsettling. Because it proves human beings can become extraordinary without magic, through training, systems, psychology, and patience. And that, in the end, is a different kind of power. By the time the ninja became global, the legend had wrapped itself so tightly around the history that many people stopped asking where one ended and the other began. So here, near the end of our journey, we do what historians always try to do in the face of a powerful myth. We separate what can be supported from what was invented, not to ruin the ninja, but to understand why the real story is compelling in a different way. Myth 1. The black suit was real. Ninja uniform. This is perhaps the most recognizable image on Earth. The all-black bodysuit, hood, mask, and special boots. Reality. Shinobi wore what the mission required. Most of the time, that meant ordinary clothing appropriate to a disguise. Merchant, monk, servant, farmer. When operating at night, they favored darker tones like deep blue or brown, which blend better into natural shadows than pure black. The iconic black suit is a theatrical invention, drawn from kabuki stage conventions where black-clad stagehands were treated as invisible. Myth 2. Ninja had supernatural powers: invisibility. Walking on water, flying, vanishing as if teleporting, magical hand signs that summon powers. Reality. Shinobi relied on stealth techniques, timing, darkness, cover, and diversion, plus careful planning and escape routes. Smoke could obscure vision. Fire could create chaos. Disguises could make someone invisible socially, because people see what they expect to see. But the manuals and credible sources describe no literal magic. The most mystical elements, like certain hand gestures, are better understood as focusing rituals and memory aids, not spells. They weren't superhuman. They were trained. Myth 3. Ninja were primarily assassins. Popular media treats ninja as synonymous with killer. Reality? Assassination happened, but it was not the core of the profession. Most shinobi work revolved around intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, sabotage, disinformation, and infiltration. Killing was risky. Risk drew attention. Attention threatened the mission. When elimination was required, indirect methods, fire, poison, staged accidents, or enabling a larger force, often made more strategic sense than a dramatic blade-to-throat attack. Myth 4. Shuriken were lethal, Death Stars. The image of a star-shaped blade dropping enemies at long range is almost universal. Reality. Shuriken existed, but their role was usually tactical rather than lethal. Throwing accuracy over distance is limited, and clothing reduces damage. Shuriken were used to distract, harass, slow pursuit, and create openings, especially during escape. Their power was often psychological and situational, not instant kill. Myth 5. Ninja used a totally unique arsenal. Hollywood gives them endless exotic weapons and gadgets. Reality. Many weapons were common to Japanese warriors: swords, spears, daggers, bows. Shinobi favored practical items and multi-use tools: rope, grappling hooks, entry tools, disguises. Equipment was chosen for concealment and purpose, not for looking special. A shinobi's defining trait wasn't what they carried. It was how they planned. Myth 6. A single ancient secret ninja organization movies. Love a hidden order spanning centuries, led by shadowy masters. Reality. Shinobi traditions were regional and family-based, especially concentrated in places like Iga and Kōka. They operated as networks of families and specialists, sometimes collaborating, sometimes competing, often hired by daimyo as professional services. There was no single unified ninja order, controlling Japan from the shadows. Myth 7. The Lone Wolf Ninja. The lone assassin, working alone, is one of the most persistent tropes. Reality. Most successful covert work is team-based and network-based. Shinobi operations relied on support systems, informants, safe houses, local guides, merchants who gathered gossip, temple connections, and coordination among specialists. A solitary figure might perform the visible act, but behind that figure stood an invisible structure. Myth 8. Kunoichi, as seductive assassin. Popular imagery reduces female operatives to temptation and spectacle. Reality. Women could access spaces men often couldn't. Domestic quarters, servant networks, women's social environments. Their value was frequently intelligence gathering over time. Proximity, patience, relationship building, observation. Sexuality might be used sometimes, but it was not the defining feature. The most effective tool wasn't seduction, it was access. So, what can we say with confidence? 1. Shinobi existed as a real historical profession. They appear in records, war contexts, and payments. They were employed in periods where intelligence and covert action shaped outcomes. 2. Their methods were practical, not supernatural. Training, preparation, psychology, and adaptability explain their effectiveness far better than myths. 3. Geography and politics mattered. Mountainous regions with unusual local autonomy, like Iga and Kōka, created conditions where specialized irregular skills could evolve into professional services. 4. They were specialists within larger power struggles. Shinobi were not independent comic book vigilantes. They worked for employers, served strategic objectives, and functioned as part of broader campaigns. 5. Their decline was caused by peace, not failure. The Tokugawa order reduced the need for covert warfare. Shinobi didn't lose because they were defeated. They became less necessary when the political environment changed. And this leads to the final, most important realization. The real Shinobi story is not a fantasy of magic. It's a lesson in systems, in how training shapes the body, how observation shapes decisions, how deception shapes outcomes, how small actions done precisely can change the fate of armies. The legends are entertaining, and they will always have value as cultural storytelling, but history gives us something rarer, proof that extraordinary capability can be built. Not by spells, by discipline, adaptation, and an unromantic focus on results. In the next chapter, we'll close the story, what the ninja legacy became, why it still matters, and why shadow warriors remain immortal in the modern world, from special operations doctrine to pop culture archetypes. And we'll end with the same truth the shinobi lived by. Sometimes the strongest force on a battlefield is the thing no one sees coming. Even after the last true shinobi stopped taking missions, their shadow didn't shrink. It spread. Because a profession can disappear and still leave behind a template, a way of thinking that outlives the people who first practiced it. If you strip away the costume and the myth, what remains is not a ninja. What remains is a mindset. Intelligence before action. Preparation before risk. Surprise over strength. Adaptability over tradition. Mission success over ego. That mindset didn't die in 1615. It simply changed clothes. The invisible descendants. Modern special operations. It's tempting to draw a straight line from shinobi to modern special forces. Navy SEALs, SAS, Spetsnaz, and so on. History is never that clean. Cultures evolve independently, and every society develops its own approach to covert conflict. But the resemblance is real enough to be striking. Special operations units exist for the same reason shinobi existed. Conventional force cannot solve every problem. Some missions require small teams, deep knowledge, stealth, infiltration, and precise timing. Some missions demand operating behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, sabotaging infrastructure, extracting key people, or shaping an opponent's decisions without open battle. And perhaps most important, modern military doctrine increasingly recognizes what shinobi practice by necessity. Information is power. A commander who knows more can act with fewer soldiers. A force that controls perception can shift an entire campaign. The shinobi didn't invent intelligence work, but they developed it into a professional craft in a specific time and place, and proved how decisive it could be. Psychological operations, winning in the mind. Another inheritance is psychological warfare. Modern states formalize it. Propaganda, messaging, information campaigns, morale operations. Shinobi practiced early forms of it in the simplest way possible. Rumors, staged confusion, misdirection, fear. The goal was often not to destroy an enemy physically, but to weaken them psychologically, to make them doubt, to make them misread reality, to make them waste resources guarding threats that weren't there. Fear is expensive. A frightened commander makes costly choices. A frightened garrison burns its own energy. A frightened army loses momentum before it even meets the enemy. That was a shinobi weapon, and it remains a weapon. Martial arts and the modern search for ninjutsu. The shinobi legacy also survives in training culture, but in a complicated form. Modern ninjutsu schools exist worldwide. Some are connected to Japanese organizations, some are reconstructions, some are modern inventions inspired by the idea of shinobi adaptability. Even when authenticity is debated, the appeal is consistent. People want more than techniques. They want a philosophy of capability. The ninja myth promises comprehensive mastery. Movement, awareness, discipline, survival, preparedness. It offers a fantasy of self-sufficiency, the ability to handle the unexpected. Even when the history is distorted, the psychological need is real. The ninja has become a symbol of competence under uncertainty. Tourism and heritage, Iga and Kōka. Today, places like Iga and Kōka survive in the modern imagination, not only as names in textbooks, but as destinations. Museums, festivals, performances, ninja villages. Heritage tourism. These keep the story alive and keep local economies moving. This revival has benefits: preserving historical interest, encouraging research, protecting sites, and giving communities pride. It also carries risks. When tourists demand spectacle, history can be simplified into costume. But perhaps that tension is unavoidable, because ninja were always a blend of fact and fear. Real people whose secrecy invited myth. Pop culture, the immortal ninja. The most obvious legacy is cultural. Ninja became a universal icon, recognized from Tokyo to Los Angeles to Bangkok. The character shows up everywhere. Films, anime, comics, games, memes. The word ninja itself becomes metaphor. A coding ninja, a sales ninja, a stealth ninja. It no longer even needs Japan to function as meaning. And yet, the global ninja, however distorted, still carries a faint echo of the historical shinobi. Silent efficiency, unconventional methods, specialized skills, mastery through training. The myth exaggerated the methods, but it preserved the core appeal. The triumph of intelligence over brute force. Why they still fascinate ninja endure because they satisfy several human needs at once. Underdog hope. They represent the belief that smaller, weaker forces can win through ingenuity. Mystery. Secrecy invites imagination. People love what they can't fully see. Competence, fantasy. The idea of being prepared for anything is deeply comforting in an unpredictable world. Moral tension. They live in the gray zone. Honor versus effectiveness. Ethics versus survival. That ambiguity makes them endlessly interesting. And there's one more reason, perhaps the deepest. Unlike many myths, the shinobi have a historical backbone. They were real enough to leave evidence, and mysterious enough to leave questions. That combination is rare. The lesson of the shadow. In the end, the shinobi story teaches something that feels almost modern. A profession can be extraordinary and still fragile. Shinobi weren't defeated. They weren't wiped out by a superior rival skill set. Their world changed. Peace made them less necessary. And when necessity disappears, even the sharpest craft can fade. But the ideas remain. Every time a modern operative gathers intelligence before action, every time a strategist uses misinformation to reshape an opponent's decisions, every time a filmmaker builds suspense around unseen movement in the dark, the shadow returns. In the next and final part, we'll close the series with a clean conclusion, bringing history and legend together, ending on the image we began with, and leaving the audience with a final insight and a question that invites comments. Because the story of the ninja ends, but the shadows don't. A moonless night, a fortress on a hill, a lord asleep behind walls, behind guards, behind certainty, and somewhere above, on roof tiles cold with dew, someone moves without leaving a story behind. That image is how the ninja entered our imagination, a figure of darkness, a weapon made human, a myth built from silence. But now, after tracing the full arc, from war-torn provinces to modern pop culture, we can finally see what that image really represents. Not magic, a system. The shinobi weren't born because Japan was mystical. They were born because Japan was fractured, because power was contested, terrain was unforgiving, and leaders needed information more than they needed heroic speeches. They emerged gradually, the way most real professions emerge. Not from prophecy, but from demand. In mountain regions like Iga and Kōka, where autonomy lasted longer and survival required adaptability, families built an unusual kind of expertise. They trained children not to become villains, but to become capable, strong enough to travel, quiet enough to move, disciplined enough to wait, intelligent enough to observe, and flexible enough to become whoever the mission required. That's the first truth, and it's the one most movies miss. The shinobi weren't defined by how they fought. They were defined by how they avoided fighting. Their work was often invisible, mapping routines, carrying messages, cutting supply lines, setting fires at the right moment, planting rumors that reshaped decisions, and quietly extracting people who could change the course of history simply by surviving. And yes, sometimes they killed. But killing wasn't the point. Killing was a tool, used when it served the larger objective. The profession was built on a colder, sharper priority: mission success. Then came the second truth, maybe the most ironic. The shinobi didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they succeeded. Tokugawa peace ended the conditions that made them necessary. Once the wars stopped, the market for covert specialists shrank. Former operatives became gate guards, fire watchmen, investigators, still useful, still disciplined, but no longer living the life that made shinobi a living profession. And as the real shinobi faded, something else rose: the ninja as legend. Kabuki theater gave them the black costume. Stage machinery gave them flight and vanishing. Popular fiction gave them superhuman speed, shape-shifting, magic seals, demon allies. And the more those stories spread, the more they replaced reality, not because people were foolish, but because people love stories that feel larger than life. By the time the modern world rediscovered ninja, it often rediscovered the legend first. And once Hollywood took hold, the ninja became global, an archetype, a symbol, a shorthand for elite skill and hidden power. So what do we do with that? Here's the final accounting. What was real? Shinobi existed as a documented profession in feudal Japan. They were specialists in intelligence, infiltration, sabotage, and deception. They relied on training, psychology, and preparation, not supernatural power. They worked as part of networks, families, villages, employers, support systems. They influenced outcomes not by brute force, but by shifting what the enemy believed, feared, or failed to notice. What was myth? The all-black uniform as a historical standard. The shuriken as a long-range killing weapon. A single ancient ninja organization controlling everything. Magic seals, invisibility, walking on water, supernatural feats. And yet, even the myths matter, because myths are how cultures remember what they're afraid to forget. The ninja legend preserved something important, even as it distorted the details. The idea that intelligence can defeat strength. That idea is timeless. It's true in war, it's true in politics, it's true in daily life. And that's why shinobi remain fascinating across centuries and continents. They represent a kind of hope that feels quietly radical. Even if you are outnumbered, even if you are weaker in direct confrontation, you can still win if you see clearly, prepare well, and move with discipline. If there is a ninja lesson worth carrying into the modern world, it isn't about weapons. It's about attention. Because attention is what shinobi manipulated. They created chaos to redirect it. They used disguise to hide inside it. They used rumor to poison it. They used patience to outlast it. In a sense, they fought the only battlefield that never truly changes, the human mind. So we end where we began, in the dark. Only now the darkness means something different. Not the darkness of superstition, the darkness of uncertainty. And the shinobi story reminds us that uncertainty is not always weakness. Sometimes it's space. Space to move. Space to think. Space to act while others hesitate. The real ninja didn't vanish into smoke. They vanished into history. But the shadow they cast, on warfare, on culture, on the way we imagine skill itself, never stopped moving. If you had to choose, which version of the ninja do you find more compelling, and why? The legendary ninja, supernatural, unstoppable, larger than life, or the historical shinobi, human, trained, patient, and terrifying precisely because they were real. And one more question, because this is where the story becomes personal. If you lived in the Sengoku era, would you rather be a samurai who wins by honor, or a shinobi who wins by results? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you'd choose, and what that choice says about how you see power. It simply changed clothes. The Invisible Descendants, Modern Special Operations. It's tempting to draw a straight line from shinobi to modern special forces, Navy SEALs, SAS, Spetsnaz, and so on. History is never that clean. Cultures evolve independently, and every society develops its own approach to covert conflict. But the resemblance is real enough to be striking. Special operations units exist for the same reason shinobi existed. Conventional force cannot solve every problem. Some missions require small teams, deep knowledge, stealth, infiltration, and precise timing. Some missions demand operating behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, sabotaging infrastructure, extracting key people, or shaping an opponent's decisions without open battle. And perhaps most important, modern military doctrine increasingly recognizes what shinobi practiced by necessity. Information is power. A commander who knows more can act with fewer soldiers. A force that controls perception can shift an entire campaign. The shinobi didn't invent intelligence work, but they developed it into a professional craft in a specific time and place, and proved how decisive it could be. Psychological operations. Winning in the mind. Another inheritance is psychological warfare. Modern states formalize it. Propaganda, messaging, information campaigns, morale operations. Shinobi practiced early forms of it in the simplest way possible. Rumors, staged confusion, misdirection, fear. The goal was often not to destroy an enemy physically, but to weaken them psychologically, to make them doubt, to make them misread reality, to make them waste resources guarding threats that weren't there. Fear is expensive. A frightened commander makes costly choices. A frightened garrison burns its own energy. A frightened army loses momentum before it even meets the enemy. That was a shinobi weapon, and it remains a weapon. Martial arts and the modern search for ninjutsu. The shinobi legacy also survives in training culture, but in a complicated form. Modern ninjutsu schools exist worldwide. Some are connected to Japanese organizations, some are reconstructions, some are modern inventions inspired by the idea of shinobi adaptability. Even when authenticity is debated, the appeal is consistent. People want more than techniques. They want a philosophy of capability. The ninja myth promises comprehensive mastery, movement, awareness, discipline, survival, preparedness. It offers a fantasy of self-sufficiency, the ability to handle the unexpected. Even when the history is distorted, the psychological need is real. The ninja has become a symbol of competence under uncertainty. Tourism and heritage, Iga and Kōka. Today, places like Iga and Kōka survive in the modern imagination, not only as names in textbooks, but as destinations, museums, festivals, performances, ninja villages, heritage tourism, these keep the story alive and keep local economies moving. This revival has benefits: preserving historical interest, encouraging research, protecting sites, and giving communities pride. It also carries risks. When tourists demand spectacle, history can be simplified into costume. But perhaps that tension is unavoidable, because ninja were always a blend of fact and fear, real people whose secrecy invited myth. Pop culture, the immortal ninja. The most obvious legacy is cultural. Ninja became a universal icon, recognized from Tokyo to Los Angeles to Bangkok. The character shows up everywhere: films, anime, comics, games, memes. The word ninja itself becomes metaphor. A coding ninja, a sales ninja, a stealth ninja. It no longer even needs Japan to function as meaning. And yet the global ninja, however distorted, still carries a faint echo of the historical shinobi. Silent efficiency, unconventional methods, specialized skills, mastery through training. The myth exaggerated the methods, but it preserved the core appeal: the triumph of intelligence over brute force. Why they still fascinate ninja endure because they satisfy several human needs at once. Underdog hope. They represent the belief that smaller, weaker forces can win through ingenuity, mystery. Secrecy invites imagination. People love what they can't fully see. Competence, fantasy. The idea of being prepared for anything is deeply comforting in an unpredictable world. Moral tension. They live in the gray zone. Honor versus effectiveness, ethics versus survival. That ambiguity makes them endlessly interesting. And there's one more reason, perhaps the deepest. Unlike many myths, the shinobi have a historical backbone. They were real enough to leave evidence, and mysterious enough to leave questions. That combination is rare. The lesson of the shadow. In the end, the shinobi story teaches something that feels almost modern. A profession can be extraordinary and still fragile. Shinobi weren't defeated. They weren't wiped out by a superior rival skill set. Their world changed. Peace made them less necessary. And when necessity disappears, even the sharpest craft can fade. But the ideas remain. Every time a modern operative gathers intelligence before action, every time a strategist uses misinformation to reshape an opponent's decisions, every time a filmmaker builds suspense around unseen movement in the dark, the shadow returns. In the next and final part, we'll close the series with a clean conclusion, bringing history and legend together, ending on the image we began with, and leaving the audience with a final insight and a question that invites comments. Because the story of the ninja ends, but the shadows don't. A moonless night, a fortress on a hill, a lord asleep behind walls, behind guards, behind certainty, and somewhere above, on roof tiles cold with dew, someone moves without leaving a story behind. That image is how the ninja entered our imagination. A figure of darkness, a weapon made human, a myth built from silence. But now, after tracing the full arc, from war-torn provinces to modern pop culture, we can finally see what that image really represents. Not magic, a system. The shinobi weren't born because Japan was mystical. They were born because Japan was fractured, because power was contested, terrain was unforgiving, and leaders needed information more than they needed heroic speeches. They emerged gradually, the way most real professions emerge, not from prophecy, but from demand. In mountain regions like Iga and Kōka, where autonomy lasted longer and survival required adaptability, families built an unusual kind of expertise. They trained children not to become villains, but to become capable, strong enough to travel, quiet enough to move, disciplined enough to wait, intelligent enough to observe, and flexible enough to become whoever the mission required. That's the first truth, and it's the one most movies miss. The shinobi weren't defined by how they fought. They were defined by how they avoided fighting. Their work was often invisible, mapping routines, carrying messages, cutting supply lines, setting fires at the right moment, planting rumors that reshaped decisions, and quietly extracting people who could change the course of history simply by surviving. And yes, sometimes they killed. But killing wasn't the point. Killing was a tool, used when it served the larger objective. The profession was built on a colder, sharper priority: mission success. Then came the second truth, maybe the most ironic. The shinobi didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they succeeded. Tokugawa peace ended the conditions that made them necessary. Once the wars stopped, the market for covert specialists shrank. Former operatives became gate guards, fire watchmen, investigators, still useful, still disciplined, but no longer living the life that made shinobi a living profession. And as the real shinobi faded, something else rose: the ninja as legend. Kabuki theater gave them the black costume. Stage machinery gave them flight and vanishing. Popular fiction gave them superhuman speed, shape-shifting, magic seals, demon allies. And the more those stories spread, the more they replaced reality. Not because people were foolish, but because people love stories that feel larger than life. By the time the modern world rediscovered ninja, it often rediscovered the legend first. And once Hollywood took hold, the ninja became global, an archetype, a symbol, a shorthand for elite skill and hidden power. So what do we do with that? Here's the final accounting. What was real? Shinobi existed as a documented profession in feudal Japan. They were specialists in intelligence, infiltration, sabotage, and deception. They relied on training, psychology, and preparation, not supernatural power. They worked as part of networks, families, villages, employers, support systems. They influenced outcomes not by brute force, but by shifting what the enemy believed, feared, or failed to notice. What was myth? The all-black uniform as a historical standard. The shuriken as a long-range killing weapon. A single ancient ninja organization controlling everything. Magic seals, invisibility, walking on water, supernatural feats. And yet, even the myths matter, because myths are how cultures remember what they're afraid to forget. The ninja legend preserved something important, even as it distorted the details: the idea that intelligence can defeat strength. That idea is timeless. It's true in war. It's true in politics. It's true in daily life. And that's why shinobi remain fascinating across centuries and continents. They represent a kind of hope that feels quietly radical. Even if you are outnumbered, even if you are weaker in direct confrontation, you can still win. If you see clearly, prepare well, and move with discipline. If there is a ninja lesson worth carrying into the modern world, it isn't about weapons. It's about attention, because attention is what shinobi manipulated. They created chaos to redirect it. They used disguise to hide inside it. They used rumor to poison it. They used patience to outlast it. In a sense, they fought the only battlefield that never truly changes: the human mind. So we end where we began, in the dark. Only now the darkness means something different. Not the darkness of superstition, the darkness of uncertainty. And the shinobi story reminds us that uncertainty is not always weakness. Sometimes it's space. Space to move. Space to think. Space to act while others hesitate. The real ninja didn't vanish into smoke. They vanished into history. But the shadow they cast, on warfare, on culture, on the way we imagine skill itself, never stopped moving. If you had to choose, which version of the ninja do you find more compelling, and why? The legendary ninja, supernatural, unstoppable, larger than life, or the historical shinobi, human, trained, patient, and terrifying, precisely because they were real? And one more question, because this is where the story becomes personal. If you lived in the Sengoku era, would you rather be a samurai who wins by honor, or a shinobi who wins by results? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you'd choose, and what that choice says about how you see power.